Okay.
Next easy question.
Yeah, just moving right along from heavy to heavy. As Christians, what should our attitude be towards the LGBTQ community? And another question that goes along with this is, what do I tell friends who are in the LGBTQ community and say that they are Christians?
Ooh.
So we can start with the first one.
Yeah.
No,
you go ahead. I just, for clarity, can we assume that first question is talking about LGBTQ community that doesn't claim to follow Jesus?
Yeah, I think that's a helpful distinction.
Yeah.
So we have those two categories.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think one of the first things is not buying into there being an LGBTQ community. I think that's easier probably for us than it would be for a teenager who sees them as a social group, or maybe even more specifically sees online as a like ideological group or something. Like we just see them in mass as like one type of people. And there's a line from a book by Preston Sprinkle that said, if you've met one gay person, you've met one gay person. And that's it. And so I just think as I talk to people who are LGBTQ, they're not all alike. They're actually really different, just like we're all really different. So one, I think the attitude should be of individuals, of getting to know them as individuals. Because when you start to have, like, what should my attitude towards a community be? You're already beginning to go, like, well, what's that community? What do they believe and think, and how do they act? And
every individual is the same.
Yeah, and you can't have a story if you're a community. So you're already almost like dehumanizing, and not necessarily in a really aggressive way, but just in an unhelpful way, I think. So that'd be my first clarifier. Then you get to, that was the easy one, so I'm going to make you all answer that. Somebody else can bounce off that with, yeah.
The next one, what do I tell friends who are LGBTQ community and they say that are Christian?
Or further
just in
flesh
general.
out our attitude.
I can keep talking, but I'm trying to learn to shut up more.
You?
Gabby, I talk a lot more. Yeah.
I feel like this is a practice I need to take on.
Gabby, it's your turn to talk.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, the word that I think of is compassion. If that's, I think, our starting place for any person, any community, any group of people, I think that's generally the right place to start. I think of that verse that talks about it's God's kindness that leads us to repentance. So compassion that bears out kindness. That's pretty vague in general. But I think if we're considering people as individuals, then we can't give you like a blanket, like this is the checklist of how you engage with a person of XYZ identity. We can give you principles that guide, hopefully, how you treat lots of people in your life. And in a sense, I don't think engaging with someone who would identify with a certain sexuality is really that different than how you would engage with, hopefully, most people in your life.
How would we say we engage, though, with people openly living in sexual sin and also openly claiming Jesus as their Lord and Savior?
Totally. And I think that's why this separate question helps, because I think there is a distinction there.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I think the Bible gives us some context there. And was it 1 Corinthians chapter 5 maybe? I'm calling out scripture.
About
I'll pull it up.
Just how to deal with people living in sin.
Living in
sexual sin.
Yeah, specifically sexual sin. Claiming Jesus as their Messiah.
And that's like one of the hard parts about LGBTQ and Christians. It becomes such a big question. There's no real authority anymore anyway, right? Like when it comes to, you don't want to get into an argument with a friend who's a Christian and LGBTQ. That's not going to help. Like starting to I should say you don't want to be aggressive. I don't think that's going to be helpful. I think trying to learn, and that's probably maybe the blanket thing, is learning their story and understanding and digging into what do they believe, why do they believe? Because I think when a student would write a friend who's LGBTQ and says they're Christian, my normally when I talk to teenagers and ask them about their faith and how they talk to their friends about their faith, they don't. So like my guess is that your knowledge of their Christianity is just the fact that they said they're a Christian and like that's it.
Very
that's
limited.
all you know.
Yeah.
So I think beginning to ask questions and hearing their story about their faith will tell you a lot, because what they mean by I'm a Christian could be all over the board.
Yeah.
It might be somebody who genuinely wants to follow Jesus and just doesn't understand that the Bible really clearly says that these things are wrong.
Yeah.
And that's so different than somebody who goes, oh yeah, Jesus was great, but I don't really think any of the stuff that he said matters that much. Like, love people, that's what matters, love people. Like, those are two very different ways of saying you're a Christian. So it's just hard. Like, in general, what you're trying to figure out is, can you help them see the discontinuity between what they say they believe and how they're living? But if they're not following a way that says it's wrong, there's no discontinuity in their mind. So then it becomes you need to help them understand who Jesus is and why we listen to his words. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, why don't you disciple this person and teach them like how to be a Christian, which is a very different approach than like get my Christian friend to stop being gay. There we go, talking too much.
Yeah, great.
Yeah. I mean, I think that really covers a lot of things. And yeah, I think underpinning that is we don't want to assume. We live in America, right? Where, 80% of the population would say that they're Christians. Is that still true? I don't know. That's the last percentage I heard.
Spiritual
If you go to
believing
the
in God
South,
are still
yes.
pretty high.
Okay.
But yeah, a lot of it's anti-institutional now. But
Sure. A high percentage of people in America would say that they're Christians without maybe actually having a framework or understanding of what that even means and what Jesus said about how we should live and what Paul and the other New Testament authors said about how we should live. So yeah, I think assume ignorance before assuming malice. What is it? Don't attribute malice to what you can attribute to stupidity. That's a mean way to say it. So maybe let me take that back.
But I would say they should also, like, if you're in this situation, I would say do your homework. If you're going to talk to somebody about Christianity and LGBTQ, don't find 3 Bible verses that say being gay is wrong and attack them with it. Like, this is a very nuanced conversation. It is super tricky. I think specifically trans is far more complicated. Just because what it means to be human, like the Bible just wasn't necessarily thinking in the terms of gender fluidity, which then people will use as an excuse to say it didn't argue for gender fluidity, right? So like some of the reading of the Bible you have to do is like scholarly level sometimes. And even some of the arguments for LGBTQ acceptance of Christians come from the scholarly level of like Greek words and manuscripts and things. Like these are not conversations that you can just find a Bible verse, quote it, and be like, see, you're an idiot. Leviticus says this. Or even, whatever Corinthians says this, you're dumb, you're being a sinner. Like, well, what if they throw gossip right back in your face? And then what will you do? So I think doing your research and thinking about it well is helpful.
Well, and in what you just said too, you're implying like not just do your research,
examine yourself.
Examine yourself and like how are you living your own life? Are you living your life in a way that someone would look at you and say, what do I say to my friend who does XYZ but calls themselves a Christian?
Find all the sin lists in the New Testament. And
then
just not to say that if you struggle with any of them, you can't talk to a friend, but like maybe, you might want to be a little more aware before going into that conversation.
Yeah.
That's
going to give me something to think about when I go home tonight. So.
Well, that's the millennial lashback, I think, against Christianity was often the hypocrisy of like, oh, so you're a rich business owner who doesn't pay their employees well, who cuts every single corner, who cheats on their taxes, when Jesus talked more about money than anything, and you're telling me you follow Jesus and you hate gays?
Yeah.
Right. Yep. Great.
It's the harping on specific sins and turning a blind eye to other ones.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
So don't do that in a small way with your friends or just people you know.
True that.
We
Have
probably
you ever heard
need
that one? True that.
True that. Yeah.
Have you ever heard that one? Okay.
Yeah. Colton used the word bossin before this started, and I've never heard someone use that word before.
Bossin.
Who's ever heard the word bossin before?
Comment down below.
I think I've heard it, but
Stop it, Justin.
I've never used it in a sentence.
This. Don't do it to me.
Once again, when it comes to those kind of trends, I'm not much of a millennial. Bossin. Yeah.
Oh. Thanks for that.
Okay. Colton, any closing thoughts on these two questions?
No, I did not have any closing thoughts.
Okay.
Use the right word.
And we're going to chug right along into heavy number 3.
Yeah.
How do you navigate an abusive marriage as a Christian? So to frame this one, in the series, we talked about Jesus' words about divorce and how he talks about unless you divorce for any reason except sexual immorality, you cause... I'm butchering this. But basically, Jesus cites just sexual immorality as grounds for divorce. So how do we think about that when we know that there are abusive, unhealthy marriages that happen?
Yeah, I think it's... That's tough. Also, can I ask, were leaders allowed to send in these questions as well? Or is this specifically coming from students?
This would have been, I think, all students, right?
I mean, a leader could have. This was an anonymous form,
I
so
think
it
was
could
only
have
sent
been.
to-
I think it was only sent to students, though.
Okay.
I don't remember. This was all.
Okay.
In theory, a leader could have sent
Yeah.
this in. But
So I have...
I actually know this was not from a leader. though.
okay,
I
you know
this
it's from a student.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to try at this. And as we say in the office, umbrella of grace. I have not myself experienced abusive relationships in any of my household. My parents were really great with each other. Kayla is really great to me. And so I always want to put that out front because I think sometimes it can be hard for people that may be living in a situation such as that and hearing from somebody that has not or been in a context like them. And so I just want to bluntly say that. But I've a really good friend that I did ministry with for many years that navigated an emotionally abusive relationship. This person was in ministry. Their spouse was not. And navigated the tension of what is biblically accurate for this person and how should they respond according to God's will in their life. And I'll say I really appreciate this person and how they handled it. I can't say that this is the silver bullet for anyone, but they stuck it out with this person and navigated it for probably 3-ish years that I know of until things turned around. Now that's hard to say from somebody that's never been in or experienced abuse in a relationship before, and so I understand that. So just saying stick with it and it'll get better is not always the easiest thing to hear. But I do think that we need to go to Scripture as often as we can and navigate what does a healthy relationship look like. I understand that. The relationship that I'm receiving is not healthy. How can I make sure that I'm giving healthy, and do that as best as you possibly can in the midst of a hard situation, and see how God works in that. I can't promise that it'll be the same as my good friend who I did ministry with, but we saw some really fruitful things from the way they responded in this situation, and it was pretty abusive. There were moments where this individual was going to counseling all on their own because their spouse would not go with them. There were moments where this individual had to leave the house with their kids because their spouse was just not in a healthy state to be around them. And I would even say that separation is appropriate. Divorce is a big word and is a big action. And so I always try to steer us as far away from that as possible. Like, let's take every sort of path we can take towards resolution before divorce is an option. But separation is appropriate. And so sometimes you get to a place where there's no way for you to be safe. There's no way for other people in the situation to be safe, and you have a responsibility to keep yourself safe and other people safe. And so sometimes separation is appropriate. But what is God honoring, and how are you giving everything you can into a relationship in order to teach possibly somebody out of an unhealthy lifestyle? I saw this firsthand with my friend, and I just know like fruit can come from it. But it's also I get that it's hard hearing that because it doesn't mean that everything will end up being peachy. You know, so yeah, that's my answer. I don't know if that was as cut and dry as.
Oh, there's no way to make that one cut and dry. I think I'd want to say that God, like, that's not the way marriages were designed. So there's no point where God like thinks the abuser is okay or good, or like the person's just supposed to stick it out because, and God's like, just deal with it. But I think, like, I'm trying to think context wise, it was so different when Jesus was talking, partially because you have families lived in like extended family homes. So you don't have a situation where there's just a husband and a wife and some kids in a home. That just didn't really exist. So the idea now of like, oh, there's this abusive situation where generally it's a husband treating a wife really poorly, not always the case, but that's generally it. And they're trapped, they're stuck, you know, like that's like a modern situation. Wouldn't have existed as much in Jesus's day. So one, it's just hard because that when a thing couldn't have happened, it's hard to like take how they talk about it. I don't know. Yeah.
You say that because there was like a larger sense of accountability in the household back then.
Yep. And
in
so
comparison to what there is now.
Yep. So if something was happening, people would have known, and the situation would be dealt with in a very different way than how we use divorce to fix those problems, where they got dealt in a more like social accountability way that we just can't even comprehend. And so there's another section in Paul's writings where he says, if a believer is married to an unbeliever and the unbeliever decides to leave, then you're freed from that marriage. And so what's interesting about that is Jesus sets up this rule, or he kind of says, except for porneia, except for sexual immorality. But then Paul kind of seems to like amend it and go, well, or like if a non-believing husband leaves. But what's interesting even about Jesus's line is he says, so it's Matthew 5, whoever divorces his wife except on the grounds of sexual immorality makes her an adulteress, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. And one of the reasons that's interesting is another thing about the ancient world is that you couldn't really live single.
Especially if you're a woman.
So he's talking to men, because the context of the question is talking about men divorcing their wives. And what he's basically saying is, if you divorce a woman, she cannot live without a man. Like, I know that sounds super sexist, but that's that's the ancient world. So what you're doing is you're telling your wife, you're going to have to go find another provider that's not me, and that's going to make her an adulteress. She's going to have to find a husband. That's the only way a woman can get taken care of. It's like so hard to imagine what a world was like when you couldn't just go get a job. Like, there weren't applications and jobs. Like, if you wanted to eat, you had to be in a household, which meant you had a relationship to the father of the household somehow. So it's specifically talking to men about that. And then whoever marries a divorced woman, again, talking to a man, commits adultery. So one, it leaves in the option of a divorce without remarriage that I think you can respond to an abusive situation with. I think I'd still counsel somebody, if you get divorced because of a abusive situation, to not remarry. Like, I think that'd be a faithful way to continue to follow Jesus, which is sad and tragic. But I think that's different than getting married or getting divorced and getting remarried. Yeah, because of his context. But then what Paul does is he kind of brings in another category, which I've heard people kind of describe as, once somebody betrays the marriage relationship to a point that they are no longer in the marriage, then you can consider that marriage abandoned by them.
How do you define that, though?
And that's the same thing. It's super. Yeah. I mean, how do you define abuse? Like, it'd be the same way of
right.
What level? If you're physically abusing the person,
very different levels and ways. Yeah.
So never you're going to need counseling. You're going to need people. Like, if it's at the state where there's that kind of thing happening, you need other people. Get a pastor, get a therapist involved, get CPS, or I guess it wouldn't be CPS. It'd just be protective services. There's a lot of help from different places that you're going to need. This isn't something you can like Band-Aid over or just fix. Yeah. But
do you think just because we're in this conversation, I don't know that it really applies in context to the question. Yeah. But if you were to counsel somebody who went through a divorce because of an abusive relationship, would there be any sense of counseling towards some sort of resolution with that individual? And would remarriage of that individual be in question? Like, is that a possibility?
Like, married back to the same person who is abusive?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's
like,
those are all like
individual. Let's say like all of that was restored, right? And there was repentance and there was forgiveness, and there were now two healthy people that were once married and they were divorced. Now, like, what's it look like? What's that road back look like? I mean, is it a possibility?
Difficult, really difficult. I mean, again, I go back to Jesus' words when he talks about the certificate of divorce given to Moses. He says it's because of your hardness of heart. Like, God didn't design it this way, but because people are really broken, there are allowances made. And so again, I think I think to get remarried to somebody who you divorced for abuse, I can't even imagine. That's like not a situation I think you can blanket say how it's going to go. That's going to require so much thought and prayer and counseling.
Yeah. What you think,
Gabby?
Dog.
Just getting all of like the millennial bro slang. The Bible Project just did a really interesting, fascinating podcast episode in their Sermon on the Mount series, specifically about, like, they're just walking through the Sermon on the Mount. So they specifically spent pretty much a whole episode sitting and thinking about this question. And they had lots of wonderful thoughts and insight that I am not going to try and distill in 5 minutes. So I would recommend, if this is something that you're interested in, I'd recommend listening to that episode. One of the things that they brought up is that this conversation, when Jesus in Matthew 5, he's actually responding to an ongoing debate that was happening during that time frame. Like, there were like two schools of thought, like two kind of Jewish teachers that had, so there were like two main schools of thought of how divorce was supposed to happen. One being that, like, you could divorce your wife for basically any reason. Like, if she did anything to upset you, displease you, you could divorce her. The other being, which Jesus ultimately kind of sides with, is that no, there's a stricter understanding of why you can and can't divorce your wife. And the framework that they kind of set up is that since Jesus in this text is responding to a very, like, certain debate, that we can't expect Jesus to be addressing all of the possible ways that marriage could go wrong and awry. And they point to how Paul, again, kind of builds on this idea of appropriate reasons for divorce in the New Testament as well. Marriage is an incredibly complex institution because it involves bringing together two complex individuals. So, yeah, it's really difficult. And I'm waffling. And I'm going to say something specific because I have almost 2 years of marriage under my belt. I have zero years of experience giving any kind of marriage counseling or advice to any people ever. And that's probably a good thing. So in these conversations, I look to people who have more experience than me, who have more knowledge than me.
Which isn't much.
How long have you been married?
Experience in marriage.
Marriage, yeah.
10 years.
10 years.
This August.
Okay.
I think I meant counseling people being married.
Oh, counseling people.
I work with teenagers. I don't do a lot of that. So.
Yeah,
no, you will
true.
Eventually.
Yeah. Yeah.
Once all them students get old enough and they're all marrying each other and.
Yeah. But yeah, a lot of experience
be patient,
being married.
kids.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
But I will say the Bible Project episode does offer a slightly different perspective than was offered here today. So I do think that faithful Christians can come to different conclusions about how to honor God in your marriage if things were to turn abusive, because that is an incredibly complex thing that doesn't happen in a vacuum. And your own safety and safety of children can sometimes be in the mix too. So it's hard to give a blanket answer. Anyway.
Yeah.
That's my answer.
We can't do the last one because I have to go.
Oh, man. I kind of like this last one.
I know, but I have to the person hasn't texted. I'm supposed to be meeting with somebody 8 minutes ago. They didn't text me.
At 4? Oh, they're not here yet then.
Okay, Colton, take it away then.
All right,
to what
so-
extent is putting God first before your boyfriend or girlfriend in a relationship too much? When they don't have time for you because they are so committed to church and family? When does it get to a point where you don't matter enough for them to have time for you?
So this is coming from somebody who thinks that the person that they're in a relationship with, this is my assumption, just reading the question, is just too invested in the church and in the relationship with Jesus.
Can I give further context? 'Cause
Yeah,
please.
please.
I know the person.
Please, because I'm about ready to crush souls, and I don't mean to.
So this is actually coming from a person, they're actually not even boyfriend or girlfriend yet when this question was asked.
All right.
So further context.
There is not too much. I mean, there's too much involvement in things like you can be too invested in the church. You can be too invested in relationships that you have with people in the church that might overshadow other relationships that you're in. But there is not, and you guys can fight me on this, there is not too much of a relationship that someone can have with God. I think that overshadows a dating relationship. Honestly, this person would probably team up with Paul and go do ministry together to some capacity without a relationship of another man or a female in their life being part of that. And I think that's okay. I think in all aspects of, at least in a dating relationship, God still comes first, is still primary, can take up a lot of time. Obviously, when you enter into a marriage, God is still first, but your marriage becomes part of that equation. So your first and primary ministry when you get married is your family. And so if you're a man married to a female, she's a primary responsibility for you, and vice versa. And then kids become part of that as well. But as we're talking about people that are friends or people that are dating, God wins. Do you all hate my answer? Because I'm kind of like married to that right now. I don't know.
We talked about this a bit before. Do you want to talk? Do you want to go? Go first.
Yeah, I hate to pile on the soul crushing answers, but my response is, and this is Gen Z. I don't know if slang is the right word.
Give some slang.
If he wanted to, he would.
Yeah, this has nothing to do with being too committed to God.
So some context, right? Yeah.
I think if someone is over and over again saying, "Oh, I can't. I'm busy with my family. I can't. I'm busy with church. I can't. I'm busy with whatever the thing."
They're just being wishy-washy with you.
Yeah, they're probably not ready for a committed relationship.
Yeah.
Anyway, if they literally cannot find a single hour in their week to go spend some time with you, it's probably because it's not a super big priority to them.
Yeah.
That's what I think. And that's a sad and hard thing to hear.
Yeah.
But
yeah, when I read this question, I don't like conflating putting God first with doing Christian genre things.
That's what I try to distinguish between like church and the people that you're in a relationship with the church.
Yep. Signing up for 7 million things and always being busy and always being God, that's not necessarily putting God first.
Yeah.
So if someone's putting God first in a relationship, they're being like Jesus, treating you well. They're treating their family well. They're having balance between things. Like if someone was putting God first in a relationship with them, you probably wouldn't have complaints. I think our complaints come from when God is not put first. Unless you want something that's really bad. Like if you're wanting a boyfriend or a girlfriend to be committed to you in a way that they shouldn't, then you might have a problem with them putting God first.
Yeah.
If you want them to be too invested, if you want them spending all their time with you, talking to you all the time, they shouldn't when they're a teenager. So they're being wise. So I guess I'll pile on too.
The piling.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I asked this question.
I thought you put this at the end because it was a fun one to end with, but I feel like we just crushed some souls.
I had a blast.
Colton loves crushing souls. Podcast title: What age should you date? And Colton crushes souls of teenagers. Well, we are out of time.
It was fun.
Thanks
for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, Colton.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
They text you?
Okay.
Yeah, they
Justin
don't
has
know
to
how to
go.
get here because they're coming
Oh.
up here. So they're just wandering around aimlessly waiting for
I
me.
got to go pick up my kids.
Okay.
So we'll see
Is
you
that gonna make it to the
all
podcast?
later. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.